This is one of my most commonly prescribed exercises, and some variation of this is given by movement mechanics professionals worldwide and for a very good reason. So, for a number of reasons, many of us don't access our posterior hip or our glute max very well. Could be that we sit too much, could be that we're knee dominant athletes, we could overuse our back to find our extension, and many other reasons. This movement pattern often leads to compensations that mean we get back pain, knee pain, and we leave a lot of strength and performance on the table. So, what I'm talking about today is what I call a strict hinge variation, namely the box strict hinge. This is something we use a lot at the training stimulus, and the reason we use this specific setup is that it blocks many of the common compensation patterns, and even body weight with no additional load, this can wreck some of the strongest athletes I've encountered, giving sore glutes like never before, just because the setup is so precise in targeting the movement pattern that is often neglected, hidden, or not tapped into. So let's get into it. We call it the strict hinge because it's all about a very precise setup to ensure we get the full training stimulus and block the athlete's ability to compensate. So we've got one of our mentees here, Louise, going through the movement today. And the first thing we're going to talk about is what are the key criteria to set this up correctly. So this is a bit different to some single leg hinge variations you'll have seen before, in that we have the non-working leg slightly forward and we have a target for that to aim for as well as the working leg. So let's start with the working leg first. We are bending the knee, and one of the main reasons we do this is to give a bit of slack to the hamstring so it's not under too much tension, which means the glute has a better chance of being forced into work, whereas when the knee is straighter, then the hamstrings will kick in sooner, which means the movement might be limited by your hamstring range of motion. So keeping the knee bent and having it kissing the front of the box here, not resting, but using that external cue to ensure the amount of dorsiflexion, the amount of knee bend stays as constant as possible through the exercise, helps remove compensation patterns of early knee extension or even squatting deeper into the movement, both of which lose us our intended training stimulus. The heel can be just off the floor. You can slide a piece of paper or a credit card underneath, but the main pressure, or where we're thinking about pushing into the floor, is the midfoot. So not too toe heavy, not sitting back into the heels, just pushing straight down sort of in the front of the heel bone, that sort of area, into the medial arch. For the non-working leg, let's go through this. So for the non-working leg, we're going to come and have a look here. We have the non-working leg's knee just kissing the side of the box now, and you'll notice this knee is slightly forward of that knee. So we're working on the corner of the box. And the reason we do this is to block one of the common compensation patterns, which is for the pelvis to rotate away from the working leg. So a lot of people, when they go into a classic B stance or stagger stance hinge setup, having the right foot behind the left, we are predisposing the pelvis to turn away from this working leg, which deloads the glute max in the transverse plane. So we don't get as much internal rotation of this target leg, which is one of the goals we have for doing hinge movement patterns. So what you'll find with this knee forward setup is that, one, they can't rotate away because they get feedback if they do, but secondly, there's a lot more stretch happening in the transverse plane, so we're asking for more internal rotation than would normally be found, so that glute should come under stretch and load sooner into the hinge pattern, so the range of motion might be slightly reduced. That is okay, because that's what we're working on, is getting this glute max long and strong. So even if you can't fold over as much as you would do without that cue, the stimulus on the glute, specifically in the transverse plane, will be greater. So that is the second key point I wanted to talk about. And the third one is this hand position. This is something I picked up from David Gray, shout out to him. And the key thing we want to use this hand for is ensuring we're getting lengthening of that glute max. So you want to put the hand over the meat of the glute, and as you hinge through the movement, you'll see Lou's, she's getting the shakes, the fasciculations, where she's going into novel territory. Her muscles aren't used to lengthening in this way, and she's getting a very strong stimulus. But the key thing about the hand on the glute is that you can feel yourself that the glute max is lengthening. You're feeling the stretch happening under your hand, kind of like a balloon inflating, and that's how we know we're getting length into that muscle for sure. Whereas if you didn't have that feedback, you could be flexing elsewhere. You could be using the knee too much, you could be rounding the back too much, and not actually getting length into this posterior hip, real meat of the glute max. So it's a nice bit of feedback to ensure the stimulus is going in the right place. And the final thing that's really important is how you stand up from here. And so once we get into a nice hinged position, imagine you're diving over a cliff, hips go back in space and up whilst maintaining all these points of contact to remove the option of compensation. To stand up, many athletes will be tempted to stand up by bringing up their chest and arching their back and extending from the lumbar spine especially. But what we want is to train hip extension first, and more specifically, hip extension from driving into the floor. So I will cue my athletes to push their foot into the floor and think about the foot driving into the ground being the reason their hip comes forward, and that's what brings them up. So having a lazy upper body, not being in any rush to bring the head or chest up, just drive the foot into the floor, keeping these points of contact constant, knee on the box, and then pushing the foot into the floor, teaching that glute to shorten from its lengthened position, is where we get most of the benefit from this exercise. We're getting better activation from a more lengthened state, which means more recruitment of motor units, more power output, and more contribution from the hip rather than the knee or the back. In terms of common compensations to watch out for, or common execution errors, first one is just doing it too fast. If you try and go in and out of this position too quickly, you're almost guaranteed to lose some of these points of contact, which means you're introducing compensation patterns or energy leaks into the movement. Secondly, losing the contact points with the box. So a lot of people will extend the knee early, and that takes the stimulus away from the hip, or they will bring this knee away from the box and introduce that rotation compensation I was telling you about, so you reduce the amount of internal rotation achieved in this left hip. Another one would be squatting and not hinging, so descending, like the hips going down and up excessively. We want the hips to stay in quite a similar position, maybe shifting back in space slightly, but actually this is the fulcrum around which the upper body pivots, and that's how we maintain the stimulus on the hip hinge rather than other musculature. So we don't want much vertical displacement of the hips or the body at all. So if somebody's squatting a lot, then tighten up the contact points, the balance point on the foot and both knees. And the final one we touched on earlier is flexing and extending from the spine. So somebody can get into a nice, perfect setup position here, but then they're just rounding and then arching their back to get over and up. So for this, I actually usually cue somebody to stay slightly flexed through the spine, but hold that as constant. The main thing about the spine is that it stays constant, so it is not creating the movement, the hip is creating the movement. So you can stay rounded, you can get them to hold something in like a Zercher position or a bear hug position and keep that focus on the hip hinge to lengthen and load, and then driving the foot in the floor to then bring the hips forwards to return to the start position. Super, super important, that one, because a lot of people who we would prescribe this to have back pain from overuse of the back, and we want to block that. If you master this exercise, you're going to add the biggest, strongest muscle in the body to your hinging. So you're going to improve your deadlift mechanics and numbers. You're also laying great foundations to bring powerful hip extension into your running, your squatting, and your jumping. So give it a go with this specific setup and comment below with how you get on. Feel free to upload a video to our school community to get some feedback and ideas on how you could improve. And don't forget to subscribe to the YouTube channel to get access to all of these exercises of the week, nearly every week. And you can also check out our exercise library of 600 plus movement mechanics exercises, which will hopefully give you some inspiration for your own training and your clients too. But yeah, thank you for your time, guys. Have a great day, and I'll speak to you soon.